Greetings, friends of liberty. One of the most significant agricultural events of this last century, in all of England, has been the enclosure of previously open meadows, fields, and wasteland, held in common by villages, towns, and communities, now increasingly fenced off for strictly private use. This process has resulted in improved efficiency and productivity of the land parcels in question, since owners can combine all their land in one central location, reducing travel needs, specialize in certain types of agriculture, since they know their land will not be used by others for a different purpose, or can utilize the land for the new Norfolk four-course field rotation system. This consists in the first year of wheat, second of turnips, third of barley, and fourth of clover and ryegrass, all eliminating the need for a fallow year, while nonetheless rejuvenating the land by the planting of different crops. The turnips, clover, and ryegrass are fed to livestock. Now, given that the property involved must change hands, the process requires a great deal of reflection among owners as to what they might exchange for their disparate parcels, and a certain degree of consensus among the village participants. It has also increasingly involved acts of parliament, with royal commissioners travelling to various towns to initiate or facilitate the process. All in all, the landlords and farmers to whom I have spoken have generally indicated a doubling of agricultural productivity as a result. Now, if we turn to the issue of the granting of property rights in land in your own 20th century in America, we find that if the granting of land is manipulated by government, contrary to the desires of the individuals receiving that land, the results can be catastrophic. In this paper, the brilliant yet virtually unknown free market economist Gary Libecap demonstrates the likelihood that arguably the greatest environmental disaster in the history of the United States, the Dust Bowl of the 30s, was caused by the simple governmental refusal to give pioneer farmers colonizing the Great Plains land parcels of sufficient size so that they could avoid farming the land destructively. The result of governmental refusal? Farmers on these relatively tiny plots created erosion on a massive scale. As Libecap begins, he mentions the central insight of economist Ronald Coase's famous paper called The Problem of Social Cost. In that paper, which is partly responsible for Coase winning the Nobel, Coase pointed out that even if the initial allocation of property rights is suboptimal, that won't matter if the transaction costs, in other words, the cost to buy more land from someone else to add to your own, are zero. But in the real world, transaction costs, of course, are never zero. So moving towards a more efficient distribution of property rights can be very slow and expensive. Was the allocation of property to pioneering farmers in the Great Plains suboptimal in initially granting only 160 or 320 acre chunks? Yes, for a number of reasons. First, the politicians of this era shared the social ideal of the simple yeoman farmer, an ideal articulated, for example, by Thomas Jefferson, who had said, "The earth is given as a common stock for man to labor and live on. The small landholders are the most precious part of the state." American politicians of the 1860s and beyond agreed with Jefferson and saw that farmers in the temperate Midwest could get along fine with 160-acre farmsteads. There, as Libecap says, there were no important economies of scale in grain production. there was sufficient rainfall, above 30 inches a year, high soil quality, and familiar conditions. But what the politicians ignored was that the Great Plains, in contrast to the Midwest, were different in the quantity of rainfall and quality of soil. In fact, the famous Western explorer John Wesley Powell, who reported to Congress in 1878 on conditions in the Great Plains, specifically had said that past methods of agricultural settlement could no longer be relied on and called for a minimum of 2,500 60-acre homesteads for pastoral regions. But he was ignored by the politicians. What could this explorer, who had spent so much time in the Great Plains, have possibly known about them? But later, everyone agreed with him. By the 1930s, USDA and Soil Conservation Service officials repeatedly cited small farms in the Great Plains as a principal source of the region's problems and lamented the failure to adopt Powell's recommended 25-60-acre plot. Secondly, these politicians, being politicians, wanted to pack as many settlers into these Great Plains states as they could, thus increasing the region's political power. And so, for example, Representative George Julian of Indiana said, "If our institutions are to be preserved, we must insist upon the policy of small farms, thrifty villages, compact settlements, instead of large estates, wide scattered settlements, and a pampered aristocracy lording it over the people." So you can see this dislike of large farms explicitly expressed with the aforementioned compact farms limiting the potential size of the homesteads given away in the Homestead Act to 160 acres in 1862 and then 320 acres in 1909. Colorado Congressman Thomas Patterson, as did many others, agreed, warning against the existence of baronial estates and land monopolies. Similarly, a public land commission in 1880 said, "The condition of agricultural industry involved in large holdings is obnoxious." Thirdly, various governmental institutions, being governmental, had no understanding of agricultural conditions and so couldn't help farmers navigate these issues. As Libecap says, neither the agricultural experiment stations nor the USDA had experience with dry land farming to recommend appropriate agricultural techniques for semi-arid conditions. The upshot was that since governmental institutions were oblivious to the problem and large farms were prevented from being established, which would have allowed successful farmers to discover and to demonstrate to others successful ways of dealing with these arid conditions, during wet periods, the Great Plains were extremely productive with high crop yields. During drought, however, yields collapsed and small farms were at risk. So what was the result of politicians wanting to pack in as many farmers as possible into these agriculturally challenged areas by offering free governmental land with ownership granted after 5 years of cultivation? The result was that hundreds of thousands of migrants moved to the Great Plains to establish small farms, and between 1880 and 1925, 1,078,000 original homestead entries were filed to 202 million acres in western Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and eastern Colorado and Montana. In addition, in some areas, with the huge influx of migrants, average farm size actually fell from 1,300 acres in Montana in 1904 to 391 in 1916. Incidentally, it should be noted that average initial farm size in the Midwest in 1880 was 175 acres. But since that size was close to optimal, by 1950 it had only increased to 203 acres, 175 to 203. But what happened instead in the Great Plains, where the initial outlay was 186 acres in 1880? Because that was so insufficient, by 1950 it had increased over 5 times to 1,055 acres. If farms in the Great Plains had been bigger initially, closer to the 25-60 acres that explorer Wesley Powell had advocated, what could farmers have done with all the extra land? They could have A, diversified by having livestock on the less optimal areas of their farms, B, use that pasture land for protecting against wind erosion, C, again, if they had had more land, they also could have rotated a year of wheat with fallow, thus keeping up to half of the land in wheat stubble, which also would have protected against wheat erosion while allowing increased productivity as well when the land was planted again. And D, if adjacent neighbors did the same thing, then both their pasture and fallow lands combined would have helped create a series of wind blocks, reducing the damaging effect of the wind by the grasses growing in these areas. Thus, statistics bear out the fact that all of these factors allowed larger farms to survive drought and wind conditions better, with Libecap finding the livestock value of surviving farms being 1,906 as opposed to 817 for non-survivors. And so what occurred by the 1930s, with the onset of the Great Depression and its low prices for wheat, which meant that farmers had to cultivate an even larger percentage of their homesteads to pay their mortgage payments? Enormous environmental destruction. As Libecap says, the dust storms were huge, some 600 by 400 miles, lasting 10 hours or more. One dust storm in May 1934 started in Montana and spread south, carrying some 350 million tons of soil towards the East Coast, depositing 34 tons of topsoil per square mile in Iowa and even 10 tons in New Hampshire. By 1935, 65% of the total area of the Great Plains had been damaged by wind erosion, with 15% severely affected. 10 million acres had lost the upper 5 inches of topsoil, and dust smothered adjacent range and cropland. The higher temperatures of the 30s also helped to turn the dry, wind-blown dirt into dust, bringing it into the air. Now, given that government essentially created the problem, what did it do in the 1930s when so many small farmers were struggling to survive? FDR and his administration, true to the progressive governmental DNA, stepped in, just as they had with the economy, and gave lots of welfare to these unproductive farmers. As Libecap says, the real thrust of governmental policy through Relief and Agricultural Adjustment Act payments was to sustain family farms. Neither local politicians nor officials of the Department of Agriculture wanted to see a dramatic loss of farmers in the region, with the agency specifically saying it is wise to keep a large rural population. Members of Congress themselves were no less maladaptive and lobbied for subsidies to maintain small farms through the Farm Security, Works Progress, Farm Credit, and the Federal Emergency Recovery administrations. As many as 80% of the farmers were on relief. So in conclusion, A, the U.S. government created the Dust Bowl, and then B, delayed the necessary agricultural adjustments. Good going, feds. The present problem, however, is that almost no one in the U.S. understands the causes, it not being taught in schools or anywhere else. In fact, if we visit a famous online encyclopedia, noted for its leftist and anti-free market bias, and if we examine its entry for the Dust Bowl, what do we find? A, no mention of explorer Wesley Powell in his recommendation to Congress to expand the Homestead Act to 2,560 acres from 160. B, no mention of the desire by most 19th century politicians to pack in as many settlers as possible in these agriculturally challenged regions. C, no mention of the destructive role of FDR and his progressive administration and governmental agencies in prolonging the Dust Bowl agony, ironically exactly in the same way that FDR did with the economy in general, with, by one estimate, FDR prolonging the Great Depression by 6 years with his actions. And D, lots of mention by this online encyclopedia of governmental scientists who, too late, advised farmers finally on the correct solutions in the 30s. Very happy for my part that in 18th century England we don't have to deal with governmentally created dust bowls, but just with the filling of our soup bowls. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.